Joining. My name is Nick from First Response Mental Health, and we are the creators of the Peer Connect Wellness and Peer Support Management System. So quick plug for Peer Connect. If you do have a peer support team or a wellness unit within a first responder department, definitely check us out, book a demo to see how our system can help equip your peer team to be more proactive and more engaged. And we do have some clients in this chat today and some new faces. So thank you everyone for joining. Like I mentioned, if you want to stay muted for the presentation, and then we can either throw some questions for the Q&A in the chat, or we'll open it up at the end and you can ask a question if you are so brave as to speak in front of all these people. And the other thing I wanted to mention was what, Kate, before I introduce Daniel? The meeting is recorded. That's probably what it was. The meeting is recorded, and if you're registered, you'll receive a copy of this after we're finished up. And yeah, we can go from there. So we are thankful that we have the opportunity to do these webinars. And today our guest slash host is Daniel Sundahl. Or DanSun, as you may know him by, has a large following on social media for his artwork, but is also a registered counseling therapist with the Canadian Professional Counselling Association. And so he's going to bring us through a presentation called Strengthening Relationships Amidst the Stresses of Emergency Work, which I'm sure many people that are viewing, and you're here because you want to learn more about that. So we have a great audience today. And so Dan, we will pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Nick. I'm going to share my screen. Now, I need to let everybody know that I do have an English bulldog. Can everyone see that okay? I have an English bulldog named Dexter who doesn't understand when I'm doing a podcast or interviews. So I don't like to put him in a room. So he's here. He might make an appearance. He might make some noises, which if you hear something that sounds like whining, that's not me. It's not my stomach. It's my English bulldog, Dexter. All right. So thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. And this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Now, a little bit about me. I'm a retired paramedic firefighter. Actually, I still am licensed as an advanced care paramedic with the province of Alberta. I just can't seem to let that go. Every time it has to register, I just can't click that button that says, let the registration go. I work too hard to get it. So I'm still registered as an advanced care paramedic with Alberta College of Paramedics here in Alberta, and a retired firefighter from 20 years. So a little bit about me. I became a paramedic firefighter an EMT back in 96. Then I became a firefighter or full-time in 2002, 2003, developed PTSD in 2014. And that's when the artwork started. So you're going to see a lot of artwork in this presentation. A lot of it is my own. And that was kind of my method of treatment, was creating these images. And 2021, PTSD kind of came back for me, but I recognized it went back to therapy. And my psychologist told me that I shouldn't be on the ambulance anymore. So what was I going to do? I went back to school and became a counseling therapist, which was that in itself was very therapeutic for me. I spent 2 years psychoanalyzing myself and my relationships. Now, full disclosure, I am a divorced man. Now, this is weird to be a divorced guy giving a presentation on relationship issues in emergency services. But during that time, I was really able to be self-reflective, and I learned a lot about how trauma affected my relationships. And it played a large part in how my marriage ended. Now, my ex-wife and I are still friends, but I recognize now how trauma really affected us. And I sincerely believe that if the marriage counselor that we had at the time had a better understanding of how trauma enters the relationship and how past traumas and current traumas cause those issues, then I think, well, who knows, potentially may have been a different outcome for me. Anyways, so today I'm going to share Much of what I've learned through school, and I do have specialized training from the Gottman Institute, who specialize in couples therapy, and have also done their specialized training in how trauma affects relationships and affairs affects relationships, as amongst some other specialized training. So this presentation is a combination of shared life experience as going through it as a first responder who had PTSD and suffer the consequences of that, including my marriage. And now as a therapist, I'm integrating what I've learned as a mental health professional. Okay. I really like this term of trauma as being, the trauma itself isn't the issue. It's the unwillingness to face that, or what we do with it. So this is a term that's often used in dialectical behavioral therapy, or even the philosophy of Stoicism. So pain plus the unwillingness to have the pain is where the trauma is. Where the opposite is the pain plus the willingness to walk into that pain is where the growth is. So in the context of trauma, in the context of relationships, it's really being able to walk into those issues and working through them. And that's where the growth happens. And sometimes that's really difficult to do. The opposite, what happens to many of us is we deny it. And we don't want to really face those pains. We want to just hope it's going to go away, which is what happened to me for many, many years. Here's an art piece that's in my house when you first walk in. It's 4x4 canvas. And you first look at it and it's beautiful. It's a big cherry blossom tree. The bulldog is me. If you look close, there's lots of nature around. And there's a meerkat there. And if you look really closely at the meerkat, he is my protector. So I'm chilling out. I'm relaxed. The bulldog is me. And I'm relaxed. I'm in a good spot. But the meerkat can see my danger. And this is my danger, which is suicide. So when you look at this picture, overall, it's optimistic. The idea is that it's tragically optimistic. That's a term I often use, where the overall concept is optimistic. But in order to grow, in order to step into that pain, we need to acknowledge the tragedies. And that's something that's also important in relationships. Now, this is a scary statistic. I'm going to be showing you lots of QR codes, so get your phone ready if you want to get more data on here. So John Gottman from and his wife, Julie, they have been studying relationships for decades, probably close to 50 years now. And they've discovered that 69% of relationship conflict is about perpetual problems, meaning that all couples have them. These problems are grounded in the fundamental differences that any two people face. There are either fundamental differences in your personalities that repeatedly create conflict, or fundamental differences in your lifestyle needs. This means that 69% of problems in relationships are not solvable, which sounds pretty bad. But the truth is that all these opportunities, all these 69% of issues are opportunities to increase and improve the relationship, the closeness of a relationship through connection and understanding, and remaining committed to your relationship and understanding why your partner is that way. So although they say there's no perfect relationship, there's always a good enough relationship. And learning how to work through these 69% of these issues are really actually opportunities. They are not solvable, but they're opportunities to increase the strength of your relationship. So it's actually a positive thing. It's optimistic, even though there's lots of tragedy. So I want to start off with, let's go over some of the symptoms of trauma in the first place. These are many symptoms that I had, and they're very common symptoms of many people that suffer from trauma. So sleep disorders, of course, that's a big one. Problems falling asleep, problems staying asleep, not getting effective restorative sleep. And that, of course, causes many, many, many issues in many other aspects of our life if we're not able to have a proper regenerative sleep at night. Memory gaps, the trauma, how the neurobiology of it works affects our memory, which can cause a lot of issues. in many aspects of our life, including our relationships. Disassociation, and how this surfaced for me was I would be in the back of the ambulance with my patient, and it would feel like I was doing a railing with myself, or things would seem, I would recognize my environment, but things stopped being, um, I, I recognized them, but they weren't familiar to me. And what I've learned now is that it's actually my mind was kind of trying to escape itself, and I was going down the path of a disassociated identity disorder where my mind is actually getting fractured. So this is a common symptom in lots of people that suffer from trauma. Hallucinations, not only visual hallucinations, but audible hallucinations as well. I would see things and hear things. Again, that's very common for people suffering from trauma. We are, especially at first responders, we are in this hyper vigilant state all the time, where we're always in that sympathetic nervous system spot of we're always out looking out for danger. And that actually changes our acuity to hearing. So our sensitivity to certain sounds are always there. So for me, it was, babies crying or birds chirping. I was very sensitive to those types of noises. And at the time, I really didn't understand why that was, or why no one else really was sensitive to those loud noises. I became very withdrawn, which is very common in trauma. Social isolation. I didn't want to visit. I didn't want to go out with my wife anymore. Didn't want to be out in public. And I would tell myself that, I just don't like people anymore, was what I would say. But what I've learned for me and for many people is that that was actually a fear response, where I was starting to feel vulnerable as these changes were starting to happen. And I really wasn't aware of what was actually going on, but things that normally would happen didn't happen as I suspected them to happen. And I recognized it at a subconscious level, and I became fearful. And that expressed in not wanting to be out in public, not wanting to engage with people. And I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but that also expressed in my case and some other cases as of anger response. So social isolation is a common fear response of trauma. Anxiety, absolutely. When I would hear things that sound like sirens or tones on my radio, anxiety came up, and that was also happened with apathy. I stopped caring about the things that I used to care about. And what was essentially happening for me, and again, is common in many people suffering from trauma, is that they lose the capacity to feel joy and happiness. But I didn't recognize that that was happening. Substance abuse as a coping mechanism. So trauma leaves this big hole, and we often use drugs, alcohol, food to try to fill that gap that trauma left. So for me, it was sugar and food as a substance abuse. Physical numbness. I wasn't aware that trauma could really form itself or express itself in physical ways. And if this is something you're interested in, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score is an excellent book on, and he does a great job on explaining how trauma actually affects our body. And that happened to me, and I didn't really recognize how that was. For me, it was numbness. I would feel numbness in certain parts of my body. And I didn't know that that was actually a response from trauma. Anger is very common in trauma. And I see this often in first responders, where a fuse gets short and it burns really, really quick. And in my case, and many other cases, I learned and I recognize it now as a fear response. And I express that as anger, as a way to try to recapture things I perceived as being out of control in my life. As a way of grasping them, it was expressed as anger, which of course caused lots of problems in many ways. Lack of confidence. I was a PALS instructor, pediatric advanced life support and advanced cardiac life support at my fire department. I was a clinical educator and a senior paramedic. And my confidence level really started to drop, which started to really affect my ability to do the job, because we really are who we think we are. And when my confidence level dropped, it affected my ability to actually do my job as a first responder. I was overcome with these emotions. The opposite of being tragically optimistic is being a toxic positivist. meaning, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. You sweep things under the rug all the time. And then you trip over that rug, which these emotions will bubble up. Some people use the analogy of a pot where you keep putting stuff in the pot and the pot overflows. But when that happens, it's when these emotions start coming out at really odd times and they need to escape, they need to get out. And for me, I would just be overcome with emotion at the weirdest times. So crying for no reason or being very emotional was a symptom for me and many people suffering from trauma. My sex drive dropped to 0, which of course caused issues in my marriage. My ex-wife naturally took this on as being, well, you don't love me, you don't find me attractive, you don't want to be with me, maybe there's another woman. Of course she would feel that way. And when she would ask me about it, I would be defensive. And I didn't know why my sex drive was down. And I would respond with anger. And then she would get defensive. But the truth was that I had no drive for anything. I had no joy or happiness for anything in my life, not just the sex drive. And I didn't have the capacity or the ability because of how trauma changed my neurobiology to express that. I didn't know. And again, it was a fear response. So that caused a lot of issues. Invasive thoughts. I would try to relax, try to open my mind. But when I did, all these horrible images and negative thoughts would come into my head. Depression and anxiety are closely linked. For me and many people, depression comes on strong in the morning. Mostly when you wake up and you feel this sense of depression. Thoughts of death and dying came up. And again, this is all a result of how the neurology changes in your brain due to trauma. And then suicidation comes in, thoughts of suicide. And when I think about it now, and I look back of how I was when I was at this point, it's really kind of scary how my brain was. And I can recognize now how that trauma changed and really incapacitated me in recognizing what that really meant. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to leave my family. I didn't want to leave this world, but I didn't want to feel anything anymore. So I felt that if I killed myself, then I would be okay. And I like the analogy of people in a high-rise building that's on fire. And they don't want to burn to death, so they jump out the window. Technically, that's suicide, but we understand that, right? We understand why people jump out of high-rise buildings that are on fire. It's horrible. But I think when trauma is involved and how it changes their brain, and I know it was like this, I know it was like this for me, is I just didn't want to have these feelings of constant dread all the time. It was worse when I was sleeping. So it's 24 hours a day. And I felt that this was a viable solution. And I thought I'd be okay. When I look back on it now, it's pretty scary, actually. But I think a lot of people don't understand how this happens. And I like that analogy, as sad as that is. All right. So what are some effects of trauma on our partners? Those are some symptoms of trauma, common symptoms of trauma for first responders or other people suffering from trauma. But what does that do with our partners? There's lots of organizations and lots of information on this is how trauma expresses itself in people. But in the context of a relationship and a marriage and a partnership, how does that affect our partners? Well, one, they start to feel anxious because they don't expect, or they don't know what to expect from us because our behaviors are changing. So they're on eggshells and they don't know what is going to walk in the door after our shift. So they start to develop the anxiety. They get confused because our moods are going up and down and they don't know what to expect. They try to fix our problems because they love us and they try to find solutions for us. But as first responders, we see ourselves as a solution solvers. We are the problem solvers. So when someone tries to solve our problems, we get defensive, especially in the context of with a trauma brain. And that can be defensive, and then that can cause lots of issues. They get angry because we can't explore, we can't control explosive emotions, and they don't understand, so we get defensive on that. So that causes issues. They start to feel hurt because they recognize that we're withdrawing and we can no longer share positive emotions. And of course, they're going to perceive that. They're going to take that personally, which is totally understandable. But they don't understand that for people that suffer from trauma, they're not able to feel positive emotions and feelings with anybody, potentially. So that they start to feel very hurt, of course. Bewilderment when partner has flashbacks or traumatic amnesia. They don't understand why we wake up in the middle of the night in a sweat or we scream, or we can't remember where you put the keys. So there's a big lack of understanding of what's happening. They go through the grief process because they start to realize that what they thought they were going to have with us isn't going to happen. So they have grief from lost dreams about the future once they realize that this isn't what they thought it was going to be. They're frustrated because they don't understand why we can't go to that place, or we can't see that person, or we need to sit in a corner of a room with our back to the wall, or that we need to take the long way because we don't want to go over that bridge. They don't understand why we want to avoid these triggering places and activities and people. They begin to resent us. They start to see us as the problem. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later about empathetic bonding and unified detachment, where it's difficult to see the trauma as the problem rather than you're the problem. They start potentially, they can see the risk of suicide before we do. Some of us might say things like, well, maybe everyone would just be better off without us. No, we don't really, they will see that as potential risk for suicide. And once they start to view it, then yeah, of course, they're going to get very fearful of that. Now, this is a really busy slide. I don't usually like putting lots of stuff on my slide. But the Gottman Institute, after studying relationships for years and years and years, decades, they've come up with this theory. And there's a QR code that you can get more information on the sound relationship house. So they've developed all these things, this theory, the sound relationship house, of what it takes or what's involved in a healthy relationship. Now, I do want to spend some time on this because then we're going to go through how trauma affects this sound relationship house. We're going to start at the bottom. So building love maps. So know one another's world, knowing your partner. Now, what I recommend for people is there's lots of things you can get online, like card decks of, ask your partner questions. And they're great because you may be in a relationship for a really long time, but you may not, there's still things you may not know. And the more you know your partner, specifically even how they were before you were together. A lot of us know our partners, from when we met each other till now, but how much do you know about your partner before you were together? The next level is shared fondness and admiration, which is the ability to notice and express appreciation for each other, turn towards instead of away, communicate the needs for attention or connection to one another. So John Gottman calls them bids for affection or bids for communication, where one partner will do a subtle sign of, hey, I need to be connected. And what the other partner does, are they going to turn toward that, or are they going to turn away from it? Positive perspective. So positive sentiment overrides negative things. And I see this in relationships, and you probably can too. If you think of a couple, are they positive sentiment override or negative sentiment override? Meaning that is no matter what they do, it's negative. Whatever their partner does is negative versus whatever their partner does is positive. And we try to have this positive perspective all the time. Managing conflict, that's a massive one. And we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds of that one later, but accepting your partner's influence, having effective communication about problems, and practice self-soothing. So learning how to manage conflicts. Make life dreams come true. So feeling that the relationship supports life dreams, it's a common thing, and creating shared meaning. So life has a sense of shared purpose and meaning. And the pillars or the walls of this sound relationship house are commitment. So each partner believes that this relationship is a lifelong journey, and trust. Each partner acts in ways that maximizes benefits for their partner, not just for themselves. So this is a theory really of what is involved in a effective marriage or couple. All right, so how does trauma affect the sound relationship house? love maps, which is getting to know each other. So PTSD is very numbing. So we don't want to know each other anymore. We lose the desire to learn more about each other. The chameleon effect is where we don't want to, we'll change ourselves because we want to avoid conflict. So whatever you want, I'll do it. Whatever you want, I'll do it. Whatever you want, let me know, and I'm just going to do it. So you lose the capacity to learn more about each other because you're changing to be what the other person wants. You deny that something is wrong. You have dampened curiosity because of the numbing effect. Fondness and admiration. We start to vilify each other through defensiveness. We have a fear of appearing crazy. So that is going to, of course, affect the fondness and admiration. We're unable to receive fondness and admiration from our partners. And our love that we have evaporates because of the trauma. Turning away instead of turning toward each other, we have emotional numbing. So we're not able to acknowledge or reciprocate or follow through when our partner has bids for affection or bids for communication. We have this hypervigilant state, which distorts our perspective of our worldview. Erotic activity or touch may be perceived as threatening. So this one and endure sex as a survival mechanism is probably more common, where the trauma, the source of trauma is childhood trauma versus trauma in the first responder community. And startled by loving gestures. Substance use may create walls between partners, which self-explanatory there. Conflict management. Other two things seem to happen. We seem to be hyper controlling because we have a subconscious sense that we're losing control as things start to change and our brain changes. So we grasp at control. So we're hyper controlling, or we're extra compliant, or we shut down. We don't want to have issues. We want to avoid them at all costs. Provoke fights to feel in control. That could be part of the hyper controlling. We have difficulties describing points of view due to our numbing. We lose capacity to effectively express how we're feeling and what our needs are. Conflicts at home may seem meaningless in comparison. So we go to work, we see these horrible things that people suffer from, and then we go home and we see that they're meaningless in comparison. So we're not able to make that separation. Conflicts may become explosive and may lead to domestic violence in some cases. Honoring each other's dreams. Compromise may occur too easy to avoid conflict. Unable to access feelings, dreams, and meaning because we lose that capacity. Poor concentration may limit longer conversations. Difficulty empathizing with our partner's dreams due to feelings of hopelessness. So we lose the sense of joy when trauma is there, and we're not able to understand or receive or empathize partners, what our partner's needs are. Creating shared meaning. A blown up worldview results in no meaning to be shared. So we don't have the same meaning of what the world is anymore. Loss of trust in everything results in feelings of feeling unsafe to discuss on a deeper level. View partners' values and sense of meanings as superficial and trivial in comparison to the things that we see as a first responder. And a sense of hopelessness and despair obscures sense of purpose. So the trauma and the effects of trauma interfere a lot in the sound relationship house. And what often happens is we blame each other versus blaming the trauma. And we point the fingers at each other instead of pointing the fingers at the trauma. In integrative behaviorist couples therapy, we use these terms called unified detachment and empathetic bonding. So the unified detachment is like that first statement of the trauma is the trauma, or the understanding or perceiving the trauma. The trauma itself isn't the issue. It's how we perceive it and what we do with it. So when we think of unified detachment, it's you are unified in your partnership with your partner, and you are detached from the trauma and recognizing that, okay, the trauma is the problem. And how are we going to how we're going to perceive that, and we detach ourselves from that instead of blaming each other for it. And we come to this point of empathetic bonding, of understanding why we are behaving this way. I understand this is way more difficult than it seems, than the words are. And through therapy, and that's what we do through therapy, is we try to get this idea of unified detachment and empathetic bonding. Another thing for integrative behaviorist couples therapy is we do this deep analysis, it's called. And what the deep analysis is the first session that we have is with the couple, and then we have individual sessions with each person, and then we bring them back together. And what the therapist is trying to do is we're trying to determine the differences, the emotional differences, the external stressors, and the patterns of communication that they're having to achieve a better understanding of why things are the way that they are. So I'm going to go through each of these in a minute, but D is for differences, E is for emotional sensitivities. The second E is for external stressors, which is a big part when we talk about the first community, our first responder community in trauma. And then the patterns of communication, which is another big thing that we work on in therapy. So differences could be like, what are your sexual interests? And these are all things that probably there before you're with your partner already. And I think a lot of us default to, well, this is how I feel. Why don't you feel the same way? So acknowledging these differences and understanding that the sexual interests are just different doesn't mean that it's wrong, but we have just differences in this part. Linked to family origin. How is your upbringing affecting your current relationship? Your desire for closeness. Your desire of closeness may be a lot different than your partner's desiring of closeness. And acknowledging that and recognizing that and understanding that is a lot better than pointing the finger and blaming your partner because they don't perceive or express closeness the same way that you do. Coping with stress, we do that differently. Just general interests. So maybe your partner's an extrovert and you're an introvert. That's just the way they are. And that's something you're probably not going to be able to change. So it's understanding that and accepting for who they are and loving them anyways and working through that. Genes, social learning history, gender, social economic status, and culture. And these are all things that were there before you were in that relationship with them anyway. So through this method, we define these differences in the hopes of having this empathetic bonding happen, of understanding why people are the way they are versus being defensive or criticizing your partner for them not being the same way. So here's some things you can ask yourself as far as differences are. So how does your birth order and relationship with your siblings affect your relationship? A lot of people don't think that. Think about, if you're an only child or if you're a middle child or the oldest or the youngest and growing up that way, how do you think that is affecting your current relationship with your partner? And here's another one. How does your relationship with your parents affect your relationship? Your relationship with your parents as you're growing up and your current relationship with your parents. How is that affecting your current relationship? And these are just differences that people have. And acknowledging them and recognizing how that could be the source of some of the issues that you're currently having. It's important to acknowledge that and recognize it. All right, E is for emotional sensitivities. Love languages, many people know of Gary Chapman's book, and there's a QR code link to his book of the love languages of how we perceive, how we receive love. And the five love languages are words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, receiving gifts, and physical touch. It's different for everybody, but often we will express the love that we want to receive rather than understanding how our partner receives love and giving them their perception of love. Now, what isn't often discussed when love languages comes up is that these are also sensitive areas that could be very damaging. So, for example, if your partner's love language is words of affirmation. So you know that, they want to be complimented, they want to, they want to tell them that you love them, and that's how they receive love. But that also means that when you are spiteful and you criticize them, it's going to cut probably a little bit deeper than you think, because that's their love language. And that can go for like quality time. If you know that your partner's love language is quality time, and when you fight, you deny them the quality time, it's probably hurting them more than you realize. So understanding what the love languages are, not only to give your partner the love that they recognize or how to receive it, but being aware of how sensitive they are as to how much, if you deny that to them or do the opposite of that, how much it can actually hurt them. Now, external stressors, this is a big one, I think, specifically when it comes to the first responder community, because we have a lot of external stressors that often get personalized in our personal lives with our partner. So what is external stressors? So external stressors are anything that are outside our couple's relationship. This is another example of unified detachment, where the stresses of the job are the issue. You specifically are not the issue. So not pointing your finger at your partner, but pointing your finger at the stresses that the job brings, and becoming unified, detached from that traumatic experience. So here's some examples. So violent crime, first responders, death, human suffering, pandemics, mass casualties, death of a coworker, pediatric problems. And of course, when we experience these things as first responders and we bring them home, they naturally can be expressed and affect our relationship. But understanding how these external stressors affect our interpersonal relationships with our partners is really important. Now, other things that are outside the couple's relationships are kids and family. Now, yes, kids and family are part of the family unit, but it is outside of your one-on-one connection with your partner. Financing, your career, illness, friends and neighbors, health and diet, and the feelings of being overwhelmed. Often we personify these issues and put them on our partner or put them on people that are very close to us, versus recognizing that these are external stressors. How can we together work on these stresses that are affecting our relationship through empathetic bonding and unified detachment? All right, I'm going to super oversimplify how to deal with external stressors. And some of you may not like this, but in the context of trauma, when people kind of lose some capacity, it's helpful to put it into a framework that's understandable. This is the radical acceptance theory. So you have essentially four solutions, four options when you have a stressor in your life. One is you can alter or change that stressor. So let's use the example of a struggling relationship, since that's what we're talking about. So what are you going to do? You can alter or change the stressor by, using a lot of the things we talked about today, or getting help, or getting therapy, or doing something to alter or change that stressor to make that relationship better. If you can't, because 69% of all issues in relationships aren't solvable, then how can you learn to live with that stressor? So how can you reframe it? How can you have a better understanding of why things are the way that they are, and learn to cope with them to help limit that stressor? Three, you can remove yourself from that stressor. You could leave that relationship. You could leave that job. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to suicide, this is suicide. People that die from suicide decide to leave life as a way as coping from these stressors. Now, what many of us do as option 4 is do nothing and suffer the consequences. And a lot of us do that, but we certainly don't want to be there. And again, I understand this oversimplifies a very complex process of stress management. But I think gives it some structure of which one of these we're going to use to better manage what's happening. Okay, let's talk about patterns of communication. That's the P in the deep analysis. In the Gottman Love Lab, they discovered that they can predict if a couple is going to be still together after 6 years based on the first 3 minutes of their communication, of them talking about conflict. And so the first 3 minutes of how do you bring up a situation with your partner is really, really important. And how can you bring that up in a way where they are going to lean towards you versus get defensive right away? And there's a method that we can do. Now, here are some rules for communicating with in couples. One, it's one problem at a time. Often what happens is your partner will come up with something and we'll want to say, oh, but you did this, right? That is a defensive response. If you feel that, we just stick that in your back pocket and bring it up later. So one problem at a time. Two, use I statements. So I feel this way versus you're doing this, you better stop it. It's I feel this way about this situation. I need this from you. Or can you help me with this? So using I statements to express things that are not making you feel good. Three, describe how you feel rather than assume how your partner feels. I see this all the time in couples. He thinks this way or she thinks this way. She thinks I do this. Describe how you feel rather than assuming how they feel. And we have to make this change in couples therapy all the time. Turn toward instead of turning against. Now, this is way easier said than done, of course. And this is that empathetic bonding component of it. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. 5, be a good empathetic listener. Someone told me once, says, Daniel, just try this. That was our therapist when we're going through marriage counseling. And he said, no, Daniel, the next time your wife has an issue and is bringing it up, don't defend yourself. Just listen. And I'm like, well, okay. I tried it. And as she was ripping into me about something, I just listened and put in a few, oh, that must be hard. And I listened. And after a few minutes of me just listening, she stopped. She had a big exhale and she came over and gave me a big hug and said, thanks. I'm like, holy crap, this actually works. Right. It's just being an empathetic listener. And sometimes we just want to be heard. And don't be a problem solver. Don't try to fix each other's problems. Just be there for each other, be an empathetic listener. And being an empathetic listener, lots of our communication is done through body language and facial expressions as well. Again, some of these things are difficult to do, but it's a lot easier the more that we practice it and the more that we do it, the easier it does get. All right, let's practice. Here's the method for the Gottmans call this a soft startup. And here's the component of it. So you start with, I feel about this situation versus when you do this. I feel about this situation. And they say, I need this from you. But I think in the context of trauma, I prefer, can you help? Because I think if we say, I need this from you, when someone is suffering from trauma, I don't know if that's going to be as effective as, can you help me with this? So sometimes it's difficult to establish what our feelings are. So I use this emotion wheel, which is great. So I feel, if you're feeling, I kind of start in the middle, bad, surprised, happy, probably not going to be happy if you're trying to bring it up with somebody, but then you can work your way out of this wheel to express how you are feeling. So here's an example, Olaf and Beatrice. Olaf is a police officer. Beatrice is a stay-at-home mom who has her very successful business that she runs from home. So Olaf is upset because he needs time to decompress after his shift, and Beatrice gives him a list of chores to do right as he walks in the door. So how can Olaf bring this up in a way that doesn't happen? Because he doesn't like it. So here's an example. I feel, let's say he feels bad. So let's go stressed. Let's go one more level up. So overwhelmed. So we can say, I feel overwhelmed about, now it's not when you do this to me. I feel overwhelmed about all the things that have to be done in our home. Either can we talk about it, or I need 6 hours when I come home from work before I have to think about this to get my brain adjusted. If you say it that way, where I feel overwhelmed about all the things that we have to get done in our house. When I come home, can you just give me 6 hours or a couple hours to kind of switch my brain over? Versus I feel attacked when you give me this list when I walk in the door. Can you not do that anymore? You can see as that other person how they're either going to get defensive and lean away, or they're going to come forward and and be more leaning toward you. Again, this is difficult to do, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And it's just to get through that first 3 minutes. If you can get through that first 3 minutes, and then of course this conversation goes on from here, but here's a good starting gate. Here's another example. So now Beatrice is upset because she needs to manage the house alone while Olaf is at work. And when he comes home, he just wants to sleep and do nothing. So how can Beatrice bring this forward? So I feel, let's say feels bad, so she can also feel overwhelmed. That's also a component of the fearful part of the emotion wheel. So let's say I feel overwhelmed, but having to manage the house by myself when you're away. Can you help me figure this out? Or I need help in figuring this out. And then it goes from there. So the goal is to get your partner to lean in towards you when something comes up versus them feeling attacked and just naturally getting their back up and getting defensive. So let's say Beatrice comes forward with this and she uses the soft startup by I feel overwhelmed about all the things that have to be done at the house when you're at work. Can you help me out? There's also a thing called an effective apology. There's 4 parts to the effective apology. If you want to have a validating apology. 1, now let's say I'm Olaf now. I'm sorry that you're upset. That's the recognition. 2, I can see why you feel that way. Now that is validating. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are agreeing, but it's having the capacity to put yourself in your partner's shoes to understand why they feel that way that they do. And maybe the reason they feel that way is because of their birth order, or maybe it's because of the differences or the emotional sensitivities. A lot of the things that were there before you even together. So putting yourself in that room and validating their emotions so I can see why you feel that way. The third part is I will do my best to try to make this better for you. So you're showing some type of change. And then the fourth part is what can I do right now to make it better? And that's the repair part. So doing the soft startup as if I feel about I need or can you help? And practicing this 4-part apology. It may be very unnatural or unintuitive to do it this way, but the more that you do this, the easier it gets. Or let's talk about more ways to kind of recover and make things better. Get help. If you're having problems in your relationship, in your partnerships, seek help. Try to find a therapist that has experience in dealing with trauma and how it affects relationships. Take your life back. The fourth part of that radical acceptance there is do nothing and suffer the consequences. If you don't want to suffer the consequences, you need to do steps 1, 2, or 3. You need to be active and make that decision to take your life back. For me, and this is weird for a firefighter to say, that I really had to separate myself from my job. So when I was at home, I tried to be a father and a husband. And when I'm at work, I'm a paramedic and a firefighter. And there's a whole more complex components of identity and attachment when it comes to this, but try to separate your identity from your profession. Devote energy to where it actually matters. And this may be difficult to do because we seem to devote our energy to where it really doesn't matter often. Limit exposures to stressors. Write out all the things that are stressing out in your life. Write them all out and decide which ones can you eliminate from your life and which ones can you manage better. And if you need a counseling, a therapist to help you manage those stressors, to come up with some coping mechanisms to do that, then do that. And eliminate the stressors that don't have to be there in your life. Use your sick time. Never take advantage of your sick time. I don't think that's ethical at all. But it doesn't, and I think this is unique to the first responder community, where we will sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of our community and our professions. And I don't think that's very useful. and I know this might be controversial. I know a lot of leaderships don't like to hear this part, but in order for you to be effective at what you do in your profession to help others and be an effective partner, you need to do self-care. And that's something that is difficult in our populations for sure. And that means utilizing the sick time that you have. Don't listen to slow, sucky, emotional music when you're sad. Now, this may not be the case for everybody, but for lots of us, myself included, music really plays, it's like an amplifier of the emotions that I'm currently having. For me, I have a separate playlist when I'm being creative, when I'm creating the artwork. I do listen to slow, sucky, emotional music because it makes me more emotional in the creative process. But if I wake up and I'm feeling sad and depressed, I have a separate playlist that I listen to when that's the case. Because if I listen to slow, sucky, emotional music when I'm sad and depressed, I'm just going to get more and more and more sad and more depressed. Be vulnerable. If you are unable to be vulnerable with your partner, um, then who else can you be vulnerable with? And I know that's really scary, but that's really where the growth happens, is that willingness to step into that pain means you have to be a little bit vulnerable. And yes, that's really, really scary to do, but that's where the growth happens. You're not alone. This is so common in many people in the first responder community with the effects of trauma and the effects of trauma on relationships. And if you look at the divorce rates among first responders, you're not alone in the way that you're feeling. So don't feel that, it's only you or you can't hack it or, you're not tough enough. That just is not the case. These are natural behaviors and emotions and feelings that result from the traumatic experiences that we have. Now, one thing that I'm a big supporter of is how core values are so effective in many other parts of our life, as far as moral injury goes, as far as who's traumatized, who's not traumatized, using it to identify negative emotions and behaviors. All the things that I've learned from going to school, I've kind of extrapolated all of them, put them all together into this thing I call the emotional diagnostic tool. And the first thing is really identifying what your core values are. And you can go online and look for a list of core values and write them down and really think about them and come up with your top 10 core values. And this emotional diagnostic tool that I have, it's almost like a pocket guide. So here's my phone. You can see by the timestamp, this is today, and this is the backdrop on my phone. These are my 10 core values. And I use this tool when I'm feeling upset about something that doesn't seem to go away. I look at my phone and I can link why I'm feeling bad about something to one of my core values. This is why I'm feeling. This is the core value that's being challenged at the moment. I can identify it. I also have an action word or an action statement for each of these core values. An example like integrity. Integrity is my core value, and I practice that by doing what I say I'm going to do. That's why that's my core value. Often our core values are validated by other people. So now other people are making us feel bad, especially in the context of relationships. If you do this exercise with your partner and you know their core values, then you understand what makes them feel really good and you know what makes them feel really bad. It's almost like a cheat sheet of what makes them feel great and what makes them feel horrible. And let's say respect. Often I may feel bad because someone is disrespecting me, and I'll look at that and I'm like, okay, that's a core value that's being challenged. But then I tell myself that respect is my core value, and I practice that by respecting others that I deem worthy of my respect and respecting myself. I can't control what other people do or feel, and I don't want them to affect my emotions this way. The more you utilize this tool, the easier it gets. So here's kind of the steps of using this emotional diagnostic tool. Once you have your core values established, then you identify the core value that's being challenged. So you're feeling bad about something. Even that first step of acknowledging that you're feeling bad about something, that's a big step right there of being aware and cognizant of your emotions and identifying which core value you have that's being challenged. And that's why I have it on my phone, because it could happen at any time. I want to have it accessible. So identify the core value that's being challenged. Then I determine if it's externally or internally validated, meaning that is it something that somebody else did, or is it something that I did? Meaning that is it maybe something my partner did that makes me feel really bad, which is now this respect or integrity, or is it something that I actually did? This third step is if it's externally. So if you've determined that this is the core value that's being challenged because of something that somebody else did, let's say something that your partner did, then you use your action, you remind yourself why that core value was yours. As in, this is my core value and this is how I validate it. Tell yourself that my core value is intact internally. This is why this is my core value. It's validated by what I do, not by what other people do. Realize others can feel as they wish without affecting your values. Again, I know this is more difficult than it actually is writing it down, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. Now, let's say you feel bad about something because of something that you did. So there's really no power to take away from somebody. It's your core value. You're feeling bad because you did something that was against your own core values. Then use the radical acceptance theory. Alter or change that stressor, learn to live with that stressor, or remove yourself from that stressor. But understand that you don't want to do nothing and suffer those consequences. All right, remember that we're at the end. That growth happens when you're willing to walk into that pain. Empathetic bonding, unified detachment, the 4-step apology, the soft startup. These are difficult things. These are difficult patterns to establish and behaviors to establish, but the more that we do them, the easier it gets. Now, if you scan that, I am going to be running a first responders couples workshop. It's a full 2-day workshop on January 18th and 19th here in Alberta, in St. Albert in Canada. And over these 2 days, we're going to go in depth on many of the things I discussed. We're going to talk about how trauma triggers relationships, recognize defensive adaptations to trauma, of how we respond, our natural response to them. We're going to go through a whole exercise in defining core values with your partner and identifying, what makes them feel great and what their sensitivities are. It's almost like the love languages on steroids, that core value exercise, that emotion behavioral tool. Learn effective communication techniques. We do a lot on the soft startup and practicing that and the 4-step apology. And the goal for this workshop is to reconnect through understanding and empathetic bonding. I've done it once with lots of positive response. I only have a few spots left. So if anyone is interested, you can scan that QR code or send me a message. I can give you some more information on that. Thank you very much, everybody. That's a QR code to my website. But thank you very much, everybody. I hope you got something out of this workshop. And please communicate with me or get in touch with me if you have more questions. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And if anybody had any questions, look at 12:01 while I'm in Alberta. If anyone has any questions about what we talked about, I'm happy to answer anything for anybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. I know the theme in the chat as you were going was that there's a lot of great information in there. So I think that's probably what's on a few people's minds. So we will make that available to attendees in a follow-up email. Just keeping in mind, lots of that's proprietary info and content from Daniel. So if you registered, you're in luck. If you're here, that means you registered. So we will send that out. And yeah, any other, Kate, I don't know if you saw any other questions or if someone would like to type or shout out their question, now's the time.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
Great presentation, Daniel. Really,
Thanks, John.
really great. I'm a paramedic in York Region in Ontario.
Okay.
You were talking about separating your identity when you get home.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that when, let's say, you're in a family and you're the medical person, and when something happens, everybody comes to you first, or if you're a police officer, whether it's got to do with crime, whatever, and everybody's constantly coming to you saying, hey, what do you think? I feel like this, or so-and-so is not feeling well. How do you kind of make that separation and distance yourself from that?
Well, I think for that, we really can't control how other people respond, right? We can, and you're right, it's a lot more difficult really get into what we identify as and how our identity is. And the first place to start is just being aware of it, being cognizant of it. The issue is sometimes if we can't remove ourselves from that identity, we'll bring the things that the stresses from work home. There's also some research that shows that if we are the fixers and we are the repairers in a relationship component, then sometimes we may not have the capacity to really open up and be more vulnerable and be more free with our partners if we are trying to protect them all the time. So are we the protector of them all the time? We may not be able to be as be a how can I say this? Be a open up and be more vulnerable with them, to experience joy with them because we're trying to protect them. It's a lot of work, right? And with the help from therapy, you can do that. Now, as far as the part of what other people expect you to do, well, then that's something different, right? You can't control that. And that does make it a bit more challenging. But the real work is to have that identity with yourself. That art piece that I showed of the paramedic hugging the devil, that's why I created that. It's that identity of being actually attached to trauma and how it actually affects your relationships in your family. So I guess the first step would be to really maybe think of how is it affecting your relationship with your family on a personal level, and kind of start from there. I don't know if that really helps, John, but
No,
I know
that
when
does.
okay.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else have questions?
There was a question, thoughts on childhood trauma and adult resiliency as a first responder and the ability to cope with trauma. And
Oh,
actually,
that's a good one.
before you answer, could you throw your QR code for your webinar on the screen again as well?
Sure. I'm gonna have to share my screen again. Or yeah, I'm gonna have to share my screen again. And so that's the QR code for the, so that's QR code for the 2-day workshop.
Right.
Yes, so that is great. So adverse childhood experiences is a quiz. Now, when I get to travel all over the world and I interview thousands of our peers, and when I do a workshop with them, I have them all do an adverse childhood experience quiz, which is only 10 questions, and it's very predictable of things that happen to us in our adult lives. And the majority of first responders that I talk to have higher than normal adverse childhood experiences scores. Now, the theory is, well, if you have high adverse childhood experiences scores, then you are less resilient. But in this workshop that I do with them, I also do a resiliency tool measurement on them. Again, it's very casual, but I've done it with thousands of peers. And in my experience, first responders with high A scores are very resilient. They have higher than average resiliency levels, which is the opposite of what we think is actually going to happen. And if I was ever to do a PhD and do a proper research study on it, my thesis is that, again, it's not proven, it's just a thesis, an idea that I have based on my experiences, is that people with high adverse childhood experiences are going to two components, there's two parts. One, they do become less resilient, but two, they become more resilient. I think that's the population that want to go into the first responder community because they want to help people because of the experiences that they have. Again, this is just a theory that I have based on many of our peers that that I've talked to. Now, as far as the moral injury goes, I think the moral injury, and I'm actually going to be doing a thing in Ottawa next month on moral injury, and I think that might be broadcast as well. But I think that has a lot to do with core values, right? Where the moral injury, you can identify the core values that you have. I think all of us would agree that sometimes we'll go on a call with a partner and it may not affect our partner as much as it affects us, or vice versa. And there's a lot of judgment in that sometimes. And I think that could be linked to your core values or your sensitivities of what certain things in the world affect you based on your experiences growing up as a child, as to why we're affected as far as moral injury goes, while other people are not. That's my thought and idea on that. So I don't know if that, I'm going to stop sharing again here. So I don't know if that answered that question or not.
We did have another question, Dan, from Karen. What is the resiliency test that you mentioned? I've heard of a couple of different ones.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. And I should know better than if I'm going to bring things up, I should back it up with stuff. But if you send me a message, I'll get the actual test that I use. It's from positivepsychology.com. And it's, I think it's 10 or 15 questions where you rate yourself from 0 to 5. And then on the end, you have a number. And based on that number, it kind of, it's not like enough. And I'm very careful to let everybody know when they do the ACE score, the ACE quiz, or when they do the resiliency test, don't read too much into it, because it's best to be properly assessed and evaluated by a mental health professional who can do it in a proper, effective way. These are just done through workshops. Workshop is not therapy. Workshops are just information. It's not considered therapy. But the one that I used, it was from the positivepsychology.com. And I find it interesting because I do the ACE score, and then I do that resiliency inventory quiz with them. And the populations that I see, the first responders, high ACE scores, high resiliency. And when I ask them why they think that is, most of them say that they are drawn to helping professions because of their traumatic experiences as children, and they want to help other people. And in that sense, again, I'd love to do a proper research on it, proper research study on it, to see if that's actually what's happening. But yeah, if you send me an email, if you send me a message, my email's daniel@dansunhealth.com. I will send you a link to that resiliency inventory. That's what I give people in my workshops.
Okay, well, thank you everyone who is still here. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but excellent information. And yeah, I know there's still some questions, still some things to chat about. So we'll shut this down for now, but you'll have our contact, you'll have Dan's contact, and we can go from there. So look for the follow-up email. And thank you again to Daniel, virtual round of applause. And we will talk to you all again soon. Happy Thanksgiving to our US friends, of whom there are many on the call. And happy Thursday to you Canadians. So we will talk to you all later. Thanks again, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I recognize lots of names and lots of faces here. So thanks for coming, everybody.